I'm the Climate and Energy Program Manager for the Nature Conservancy in Illinois. And I want to thank Laura and also Maria and the Chicago Wilderness Alliance for hosting this cafe. They've done a lot of the work to do the logistics and get the word out, so I really appreciate that. And I'm excited to have the opportunity to discuss our new guide on smart renewable energy siting and pollinator-friendly solar for Illinois. And this is a guide that TNC developed in collaboration with the Pollinator Partnership. And Laura Morandin and Jared Fowler from the Pollinator Partnership are with us today and will be around for Q&A at the end. As for what I'll cover, at the highest level, the conversation today is about where we site new renewable energy and how we manage those sites to maximize the co-benefits for nature and people. I'll dedicate roughly the first half of the talk to smart siting, providing some context about renewable energy expansion and discussing best practices for how to site renewables with the fewest negative impacts to habitat and sensitive species. In the second half of the presentation, I'll provide a high-level overview of the benefits of pollinator-friendly solar and talk through the basics of preparing, planting, and managing pollinator-friendly habitat on a solar energy site. So starting with smart siting, let's talk about how much renewable energy we need to meet our climate goals and some of the challenges this build-out could have. In general, we know that large-scale wind and solar development is a key part of greening the US economy and curbing carbon pollution. Transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables is critical for avoiding the worst impacts of climate change. This is true for all of us, but it's especially true for the most vulnerable frontline communities. At the same time, meeting our country's clean energy needs will require millions of acres of land. By some estimates, the required land-based renewable energy infrastructure could have a footprint larger than the size of Colorado and Wyoming combined. And that level of development does create the potential for conflicts with local communities and has the potential to negatively impact natural areas and critical habitat, environmental services. And ultimately, that increases the chance of slowing down progress towards the transition to renewable energy. So the guide that we developed in part highlights ways to alleviate some of those impacts. Now let's look a little closer at the renewable energy build out here in Illinois specifically. Overall, we still have a long way to go to meet our renewable energy goals. As of 2021, only about 11% of our state's power generation came from renewable energy, and that was mostly from wind. As you can see from this pie chart, Illinois gets about half of its energy from nuclear and nearly a quarter from coal. In the transition to clean energy, we expect the size of the nuclear wedge to stay roughly the same, at least for the time being, whereas the coal wedge should essentially disappear, and that would transition to more wind and solar. So with the passage of CEJA, the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, which is something that probably a lot of you have heard of, but that was ambitious climate legislation that was passed over a year ago now. In that legislation, Illinois set goals to reach 40% renewable energy by 2030 and 50% by 2040. So with those goals in mind, we'd expect to see about a 5-fold increase in renewables on the landscape here in the state in the next 2 decades to meet that 2040 goal. Currently, according to the solar industry, about nearly 5,000 megawatts of solar is planned for Illinois in the next 5 years. And we know it takes about 7.5 to 10 acres of land to deliver 1 megawatt of solar with current technology. So this amount would impact up to nearly 50,000 acres in the state. And we would assume this number could increase somewhat quickly owing to influxes in state and federal funding for renewable development. In total, over the long run, based on the latest modeling from Princeton and NREL, we might expect to see between 155,000 and 320,000 acres of solar built in Illinois by 2050 to meet a national net zero goal for the US. And I'll just conclude this slide by mentioning that I haven't been able to track down near-term growth projections for wind as easily as they're readily available for solar. But in general, we do know that wind already makes up a much larger proportion of the renewables mix, and that trend is going to continue. According to Princeton's net zero report, we would expect to see over 5 times as much power coming from wind than solar by mid-century. So in general, wind is going to continue to make up a big portion of the mix, but we still expect to see a big expansion of solar. And so we'll be talking a lot today about just how to take advantage of that expansion and make sure we're minimizing negative impacts, maximizing the positive. In this discussion about the renewable build out, it's also important to note that the potential impacts vary by region and also by technology. So no need to dig in deep into this legend. I'll kind of walk you through what these images are telling us. These are some snapshots of TNC's Site Renewables Right map, which is a tool that shows where wind and solar can be sited with minimal impacts to key wildlife areas and important habitat. Essentially, any part of the landscape that is not white indicates an area where there may be potential conflicts with wildlife or wildlife habitat. And that is not to say that wind and solar should be off limits in all of those areas. Just it's a way to flag the potential for concern and to indicate that those areas should be studied with a little more intensity before developing a particular site. And whereas you can see, if you look towards the west and even up in the north Midwest, there are essentially no areas look great for development. Whereas if you look at the map of Illinois on the right, you can see a lot of the state is most likely okay for development. This is largely owing to the fact that such large areas of the state have already been converted from natural habitat to agriculture. Any of the areas in white are likely to have more minimal impacts to nature, although developers should always do due diligence and follow best practices to minimize harm at specific sites. And there are still important areas to avoid in Illinois. This is particularly true for wind with regard to birds and bats. For instance, the light blue circles you can see like along the Illinois River southwest of Chicago, that indicates an area of important bat roosting. And so major wind development should probably be avoided there, for instance. Also, this map highlights any protected areas. Those are captured on the map as places to avoid development for both wind and solar. Even though Illinois, as I just described, may have more land suitable for renewable development with fewer adverse impacts to nature than other states, it's still important to prioritize the selection of low impact sites to minimize environmental disturbance. Known as smart siting, this is definitely the most effective way to reduce harmful effects of new renewable energy on nature. We recommend just across the board avoiding new construction that requires converting natural habitat or where there is a moderate to high probability of negative impacts to species of concern. Smart siting principles are important for both wind and solar. However, in a state like Illinois, wind can be more easily integrated into our existing agricultural landscape in a distributed manner. So in our guide, we do focus on providing recommendation for low impact areas for solar siting. Specifically, we recommend prioritizing solar development in the built environment, contaminated and degraded lands, and marginal farmland. The built environment essentially includes rooftops and parking lots in particular. Those are ideal locations for low impact solar. The more we can distribute solar on those sites, the better. But they do tend to be smaller, so you don't get up to the utility scale level of production. Illinois, we have started to do analysis on this. Illinois also contains really ample contaminated and degraded lands, including brownfields, former mine lands, idle industrial areas. Those can also be great locations for siting renewable energy projects. In particular, there are limited options for redeveloping those sites in a useful way. And so this can be a great way to reuse those sites safely and productively, and a beneficial way to repurpose the land. Also, right now, I just will flag that there are new state and federal policies that should help incentivize solar on degraded lands. For instance, Department of Energy will be offering a 10% tax credit for renewables built on brownfields and areas recently dependent on the fossil fuel industry. So hoping to see more development on those lands as the incentives help push people in that direction. Finally, I'll just mention that agricultural land that's less suited for growing crops or has low productivity, such as drought-prone or highly erodible farmland, could also be prioritized for renewable energy development to take some of the pressure off of developing on prime farmland. It can also sometimes provide an alternative revenue stream for small and mid-sized farmers who are trying to compete with the larger farm holders. So yeah, just overall I'll mention that if we can prioritize more and more development on these sites, it will take pressure away from impacts to natural areas or prime farmland. And on the topic of farmland, I'm going to spend a minute on this just because it's such a key issue for Illinois. In general, smart siting can take some of the pressure off of developing new solar on prime farmland, but I will note that in Illinois, it is often more straightforward for developers to place solar on prime farmland, in particular because it's easier. The sites are flat, they're well drained, and they are abundant. Illinois contains just a massive amount of farmland, 27 million acres to be exact. And about 24 million of those acres are considered to be prime farmland. So to a certain extent, it's inevitable that at least a portion of new renewable sites will end up on this land. And notably, this is mainly an issue for solar development. As I mentioned, wind turbines can be integrated more seamlessly into the row crop landscape that is so dominant in the state. So to the extent that solar ends up on farmland, it's worth thinking through options that will continue to ensure that Illinois' high quality soils are still put to good use, and that we are thinking of practices that are regenerative and really protecting that soil resource that we have. One option is to pair solar arrays with specialty crops or grazing to continue to extract agricultural products from the land. And that option is known as agrivoltaics. This is still a new area of practice and experimentation, but it could offer opportunities to diversify Illinois' agricultural landscape in tandem with more clean energy. The other option is to pair solar arrays with native plants, a native prairie habitat designed to attract pollinators. And notably, collocating pollinator-friendly habitat with solar also benefits agricultural production by supporting pollination and natural pest control. This is something I learned in developing this guide, that even soybeans, which aren't pollinator dependent, do still benefit from the presence of pollinators. It can increase yields by up to 20%. So even our standard conventional agriculture can benefit from having more pollinators on the landscape. And then finally, I'll mention that well, I'll save that for the next section. But so essentially, while there can be some preference for avoiding solar on prime farmland that's legitimate, the use of agrivoltaic systems and pollinator-friendly solar practices can also have a lot of benefits and reduce the drawbacks of developing on prime farmland. And I'll even note that the high-quality pollinator-friendly, that if you actually develop a high-quality pollinator-friendly site, it's almost certain to have greater benefits for the environment than conventional row crop agriculture. On that note, I will switch gears to talk more in depth about pollinator-friendly solar, the other half of our talk today. As I just mentioned, in the context of agriculture, besides choosing low impact sites, another great way to maximize the benefits of solar for nature, for people, for climate, is to plant a diverse mix of native prairie plants under and around solar arrays. More frequently, turf grass would be used at solar sites. That's what you'll see most often. And or low diversity mixes, or even sometimes gravel. Gravel in particular is really not the best option in terms of maximizing the environmental benefits of a site. But a quality pollinator-friendly solar installation has many more benefits. As the name suggests, it's obvious, I guess, that pollinator-friendly solar is good for pollinators, owing to widespread habitat loss and increasing pressures from pathogens, invasive species, insecticides, and also climate change. Pollinators are in decline, and given how vital they really are for maintaining biodiversity, food security, life on Earth, actions to support them are critical. And so by planting pollinator-friendly vegetation in and around solar panels, we can help to support the long-term survival of vulnerable and endangered species like the monarch butterfly and the rusty-patched bumblebee. Compared to a solar site with turf grass, one study in the Midwest did find that integrating native plantings into solar installations increased pollinator abundance by 30%. So as people have started to study the impacts, we are seeing that it can have a significant impact. So another benefit, owing to the deep roots of native prairie plants, pollinator-friendly solar also improves water quality and soil health by improving stormwater infiltration and water retention during drought and reducing soil erosion. Studies have also shown that planting pollinator-friendly habitat at solar sites increases carbon sequestration, and it can increase it up to 35% more than solar developments with turf grass. So that's another positive for the climate. As I mentioned already, pollinator-friendly solar can also benefit local agricultural production. Just reiterating that by attracting pollinators and other beneficial insects, these sites can support local crops with pollination and pest control. And then just two more benefits I'll mention. Although the research is still ongoing, early evidence does suggest that this practice can also reduce long-term management costs at solar sites. Essentially, it cuts down on the need for mowing and other inputs and reduces risks related to frost heaving because of the roots, erosion, and flooding. The upfront costs, I do want to be clear, of installing a diverse planting and managing it during the first few years to make sure that it's well established, can be higher than a conventional solar site. I mean, almost definitely higher than turf grass, but it should reduce costs over the long term. And I'm looking forward to, I know Argonne and some other partners are studying some of these cost benefit analyses, and it'll be really interesting to see the results of those studies, which hopefully come out soon. Last but not least, I want to mention another important benefit of pollinator-friendly solar is beautification. Pollinator-friendly plantings are prettier to look at and can help improve community buy-in by creating a more naturalized landscape. As with any pollinator planting, with or without solar, a good seed mix has to be developed that's appropriate for local site conditions and attractive to native pollinators. So to start, the seed mix should contain mostly native species. Native species are inherently adapted to the local climate conditions and provide the best food resources and habitat resources for local pollinators and other wildlife that have evolved to use those plants. In general, we'd always recommend a seed mix that contains the widest possible diversity. A good mix will contain grasses, sedges, and multiple native wildflower species, paying attention to including flowering species that bloom throughout the growing season, and diverse flower sizes, forms, and colors to attract different pollinators. Some pollinators in particular require specific host species for reproduction. That includes the monarch, for instance, that only reproduces on milkweeds. So it's important, if you're trying to cater a site to particular species, that you pay attention to whether or not there are particular host species that should be included in your mix. And then finally, I do want to mention, this goes back to the topic of cost. in general, a really high quality seed mix might cost more. So budget constraints can enter in here, and considerations can vary year to year, depending on what seed vendors have and what they're charging can fluctuate. So any seed mix you might adapt based on what's available and what your cost constraints are. But to the extent possible, maximizing diversity is key. As you would expect, plants should also be selected that take into account soil type. Different plants will thrive on wetter, moist soils versus other plants that are adapted to drier, well-drained soil. And finally, this is maybe the biggest topic to consider for a pollinator-friendly solar mix. There is this constraint of panel mounting height. And in particular, if you have panels that are fixed, the height of the panel along the lowest edge is something you have to take into consideration. And so I'll spend a second talking about that. Because you probably cannot stress enough what a limiting factor panel height is for developing your seed mix. In general, I guess it goes without saying, the higher the panel, the more diverse the planting can be. A lot of prairie plants are quite tall. And so if you have a really short panel, it will limit what you can plant underneath. Ideally, solar panels will be mounted at least 3 feet off the ground on the lowest edge to allow for a high quality pollinator planting. And I'll note that that's not standard practice if at like a utility scale site, but it is without a doubt the best way to include diverse pollinator friendly habitat. You can also achieve a moderately diverse planting under panels with a lower edge of 2 feet, but it will start to restrict your options. And then finally, solar panels with a lower edge of 18 inches or lower, which is very common in the solar industry. I'd say that's more standard. That severely restricts options for vegetation. The vast majority of native prairie species will exceed 18 inches in height. So really the best you can do under lower mounted panels is to plant a lower diversity mix of primarily non-native species such as clovers and fescue grasses, because these plantings will, actually meet the height restrictions, but offer some level of benefit to pollinators. But because these plantings really do offer less floral diversity and have shallow root systems, so they're also not going to offer those benefits of infiltration and stabilization at the site. They won't provide the same benefits that diverse plantings will. So really at those sites, it's critical to also think about your perimeter and plant a diverse mix around the perimeter because the perimeter doesn't have the same height restrictions. So before I move on from this topic, I just will reiterate, although I probably already made it clear, that not all pollinator-friendly solar is created equal. At the moment, there are no rules around this, so someone can claim to have a pollinator-friendly solar installation, even if they've really planted a low diversity mix under short mounted panels. In general, achieving like a legitimately high quality planting does depend on having those higher mounted panels. And as I'll say, you can kind of overcome it on a site with low mounted panels if you're paying a lot of attention to the perimeter or any other open spaces you can take advantage of and really planting a high quality mix there. And so in our guide, we do provide several sample mixes that take height constraints, soil type, and plant diversity into consideration, including mixes for panels at 18 inches, 2 feet, and 3 feet, and a perimeter mix. And I'll just say that the mixes we recommend are intended to serve as a starting point for conversation with local land managers, and as I mentioned, seed vendors, since the supply can vary. Conversations with local experts will really help to determine the most appropriate mix for a given site. Site preparation at solar sites is not that different from site prepping a standard prairie restoration project, so I won't go into a lot of detail here. However, I will just note that it's a critical step because it clears the site of any pernicious weeds, invasive species, and just prepares you with a clean slate for planting. To do it well, you need to give it time, and it can take up to 1.5 years. Project timelines for solar developments can complicate the ability to do that well. So it's important to make sure that this aspect, if you're planning to do pollinator-friendly solar, it's really important to get in at the beginning of a project to make sure that it's integrated into the plan, and that it will meet local regulations, any of the timelines that are imposed on a process, that they have made space to do this process well. Different practices can be used to prepare a site. Often involves mowing and spot treatment with herbicides at a really big utility scale site. But I will say organic practices can also be used effectively, especially at smaller sites or where that's a priority. In general, the easiest site preparation is going to happen on recently farmed row crop fields, because herbicides have been applied for years and essentially killed the weeds in the seed bank. Whereas if you're working on a fallow site that hasn't been farmed recently, it can take longer to address weeds in the seed bank and really make sure that the site is ready for planting a new native planting. I'll just mention one other thing about site preparation that can be unique to recently farmed row crop areas, and that's related to fertilizer use. Because our fields get doused in nitrogen, that high level of nitrogen can persist in the soil for a little bit, for a few years, for a few seasons. And that can cause some prairie plants to respond quite aggressively and grow higher than they even normally would. And so you might have to have some more, pay more careful attention to mowing in those first few years until the nitrogen levels start to just balance out to a natural level. So just something to pay attention to if your plants grow even taller than you expected. Okay, planting. Similarly, I won't go into a lot of detail here just because it's not unique to solar. The guide that I mentioned that we developed does go into more detail on this, but it's for today's presentation, I'll just highlight one thing, which is related to planting time, because ideally we would recommend planting in the winter, between December and early February in most years. And this is because it's favorable to most perennial wildflower species. So if you're trying to favor wildflowers over, say, grasses, we would prefer that the planting happen in the winter. And ideally, planting over snow is ideal, as the natural freeze-thaw cycles will help to ensure good seed-to-soil contact and planting depth. Whereas planting in the spring is less ideal. You won't, one, it could be harder to get that perfect contact, and then it will also favor grasses and some annual forbs. Of course, winters like the winter we had this year aren't ideal for this recommendation, but so this is something that will have to be managed over time as climate affects our ability to do restoration in the ways we have in the past decades. As with Also with any prairie planting, it's important to manage it over time to maintain a healthy habitat and maximum diversity. Normally, management would include prescribed fire, and that would be a big recommendation, but that's obviously not an option in solar sites unless you want to wipe out your solar panels, which would be obviously not the right outcome. So instead, a mix of mowing and spot treatment with herbicides can be used. Alternatively, as I mentioned, organic practices can be used, particularly at some sites that are smaller. In general, in the first few years, management will be more intense as the site gets established, but it will taper off after year 3 usually. Once the vegetation is established, the management regime will be less intense than the management regime that would be required at a conventional solar site with turf grass, where you would just have to keep mowing, quite frequently for the duration of the site, as keeping pace with as the turf grass growth. So because of that, because of this reduction in management over time, we would expect the cost of the management to go down compared to a turf grass site also. Finally, I'll just say it's important to mention, since mowing's on the list of maintenance options here, it's important to make sure that anyone in charge of management at a pollinator-friendly solar site is well informed about best practices. I've noticed, people tend to have a proclivity, or seem to have a proclivity for pretty aggressive mowing habits. It's definitely not unheard of for someone to mow too frequently or to mow too low and damage a planting. Established pollinator habitat really shouldn't be mowed below 6 inches, or there's a high risk of plant mortality. So you don't want someone coming into the site and essentially just mowing down to like a standard mowing height, and then all of a sudden your planting that you put so much effort into is gone. So really working with the people who will be actively managing a site is pretty critical for the long-term health. Beyond planting pollinator-friendly habitat under and immediately around panels, there are just a few more options for enhancing habitat on solar sites that I'll mention before wrapping up this presentation. For one, if there are any special natural features that cannot be avoided during the siting process, so where you initially pick the site, there might be the presence of wetlands on a small portion or streams or other natural habitat. It's important for the developer to incorporate those into the site design, but without putting panels on top of them, and to protect them to provide wildlife habitat on the site. As I mentioned, when I was talking about solar panel mounting height, it's also possible to create high quality habitat around the perimeter of solar installations, either in the form of additional prairie or you could do a hedgerow consisting of diverse native shrubs and trees. And we'd recommend creating habitat around the perimeter regardless of how high panels are. It can go with any kind of solar site, but it's definitely critical if you have a site, as I mentioned, with low mounted panels. Bird perches and nesting boxes can also be added to a site to support more wildlife. And finally, the use of wildlife-friendly fencing can reduce barriers to wildlife movement through a site. Wildlife-friendly fencing has bigger holes at the bottom, and so that will allow your small to mid-sized creatures to pass through, and really providing more ways for different types of wildlife to inhabit a site can benefit the long-term health of a site. Yeah. Now, I pause because not all developers want a lot of wildlife on the site, particularly deer. So that's why they end up getting fenced. But it is important to at least allow passage to have some diversity of mammals and other creatures on the site. So before switching over to questions, just momentarily, I'll conclude by saying, I do think this is a key moment to make a big push across the state to see broad uptake of the practices outlined in this guide. As we see a big boom in new renewable infrastructure, we do have the opportunity, time-sensitive opportunity really, to encourage new development that minimizes harm and maximizes the benefits to Illinois' natural environment and really to our communities and the climate. Since the Prairie State has already lost a significant portion of its natural habitat, we should be looking to ensure that all new solar energy is sited in low impact sites and plays a role in helping to reclaim some of what we've lost, particularly by pairing solar arrays with pollinator-friendly habitat. Generally, the average solar installation will last for about 20 to 30 years. So decisions made today about where they're sited and how they're managed really are critical for the benefits we can obtain in the next 2 to 3 decades. So yeah, I would just encourage anybody to try to advocate for this practice, or we're interested certainly in seeing more pilots pop up across the landscape. So if people are interested in learning more about the guide, definitely reach out to me or, as I mentioned, my co-conspirators, Jared and Laura from Pollinator Partnership, who are here. And then I'll just say, to learn more, you can download the full guide from TNC's website at the moment, nature.org/ILClimate, which is up here on this. And I know Laura Riley will send out that link as well. And then I know Pollinator Partnership will have it up on their website also. So with that, I'll turn it over to questions. Thank you for listening. I'll just note one more time that Laura and Jared from Pollinator Partnership are also here to help field any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was really fascinating. I really appreciated the presentation and the discussion on the height differentials on the solar panels. Does anybody have any questions? You can either put it in the chat and I'll read it out. You don't have to unmute yourself, or just go ahead and unmute and ask them your questions directly. Megan has a question. She says that I know that Illinois has goals for solar and wind energy, but as your map showed, Western states don't have the availability to implement these energy options on low impact lands. So is Illinois thinking about how they can play a role in providing energy to other states?
I think I'll take a first shot, but anybody on the line is welcome to answer this if they're more knowledgeable. There's no doubt we already export a lot of nuclear energy to other states. So that's one thing I will note. But with renewables, this is definitely something that is related to making sure that across the country we have an ideal outcome and minimal impacts to nature across the country. You would expect to see maybe more renewables pop up in certain areas than others. This gets really complicated though with, say, renewable energy bans in certain states. Like there are states that probably could be developing more renewable energy that don't have the same policies on the books to allow them to really develop as quickly as possible. Some of our surrounding Midwestern states included. So yes, to a certain extent, I think you're right. But it's also hard with the grid. The grid gets really complicated, and so to distribute energy really far is also not as easy. So we will need the Western states to also develop their own energy resources. So I'm not giving a very satisfying answer just because it's complicated, but yeah, I'll pause there. If anybody else is more of a renewable energy expert and more of an expert on the grid or this topic, feel free to pipe in as well.
Okay. Kate has a question. She says, does a 4+ mowing reduction assume a 3-foot panel height?
Maybe you could repeat the question.
Okay. Does a 4+ mowing reduction, I think it was in your chart about the 4 years, or a 4+ mowing reduction assume a 3-foot panel height. Kate, feel free to unmute and clarify that question further.
Yeah, I was just wondering for sort of those maintenance recommendations, there was basically a step down in the mowing events per year, and like after like year 4+ that you were showing maybe only mowing every 1 to 3 years. Does that assume the 3-foot panel height?
Although it does.
Yeah, I will also let Laura and Jared jump in here if they have a good answer to this. I think these are average recommendations. Like you would have to pay attention to your exact site to know if you need to continue mowing. But the low mount on a low mounted panel, if you plant the low growing seed mix, it shouldn't grow very high. So it shouldn't change the management recommendations all that much. But then I'm going to be fully transparent that my expertise is less with the pollinator-friendly solar habitat and more with the smart siting. Whereas I know Jared and Laura have more experience with prairie restoration and maintenance. So if you have anything you want to add, please feel free.
Yeah, I'll start and then Jared might have some more, but like Karen said, you're going to plant your lower growing herbaceous plants below those lower angle panels, the ones that have the lower leading edge. But you're also going to get incursion of weeds more likely that do grow taller. So I would suspect that you're not going to be able to reduce the mowing quite as much with that lower panel as you would with the higher panels.
Makes sense. Bill Miller has his hand raised. Go ahead, Bill. Go ahead and unmute yourself and
Sure.
ask a question.
I guess a question, I read something recently that this type of an agrivoltaic, or perhaps the pollinator-friendly as well, actually increases the efficiency of the solar cells by having lower temperature at the bottom of the cell, so that the solar panels are actually more efficient. And I think I saw something else, that shading by panels can actually protect some crops in areas where there's, you know, drought or high heat stress. So I wonder how much of whether more research is needed for understanding the sort of the impacts back and forth. In other words, what crops might having partial shade be beneficial? For what type of systems might you actually get greater efficiency, and therefore, you know, need fewer panels for the same power or get more power output?
Yeah, once again, I'll start, and then Laura or Jared, feel free to jump in. I know to the first aspect of your question, Bill, with the efficiency of the panels, the studies I've seen have mostly been done in arid environments in the West, and then where they definitely saw an increase in panel efficiency with plantings underneath. There was one study done in Minnesota where in the more temperate climate, especially with humid summers, the results were less conclusive, but it's still, I think, an outstanding question for this Midwestern climate, whether or not it will increase panel efficiency. But I know, as I mentioned, like Argonne, UIC, and I think a couple of other partners, that's one of the things they're studying currently. So it'll be really interesting to see the results of their research. And then, yes, with agrivoltaics, I think that definitely is just an area of experimentation right now, like which plants can benefit from the shade in which environment, which plants thrive, how you manage them. That area is ripe for a lot of research and study.
Okay, great, thanks.
Megan mentions that at the recent Wild Things conference in Chicago, it was mentioned that the native seed supply isn't going to be able to support our renewable energy and all of our habitat restoration. How can Illinois lead on processes and access to the seed produced through these plantings and help with the shortage? Good question, Megan.
Yeah, that's a key question for all restoration. And which I would include, you know, pollinator-friendly solar as like a component of landscape restoration. And there's no doubt that the shortage is real. It's something that, you know, at the Nature Conservancy, I have colleagues who are trying to work on tree restoration initiatives in Southern Illinois and are running into this issue. One thing we're trying to explore is, can we bring back more investment in state nurseries, ways to provide essentially that local resource to restoration initiatives, both for renewable energy purposes and for your traditional habitat restoration. It's also something, it's why I mentioned that it's key to consult your local seed vendor as you develop your seed mix, because, you know, we provide suggested seed mixes, but we also recognize that this seed shortage and availability is very real. And so it's something that has to be considered when you develop your seed mix, and costs can fluctuate. You know, in talking to someone who I think was part of that Wild Things presentation, who works in Lake County, I know even like kind of silly efforts to try to coordinate on procurement requirements. Let's see if I can explain this easily. Like if one little project or one municipality puts out a request for particular seed, a seed vendor isn't necessarily going to respond to that. Whereas if we were to coordinate more on the way we're procuring seeds at the regional scale and synthesizing some or creating language that's shared across different projects and municipalities, we might be able to send a signal to vendors that there is a demand there. So I think there are ways that we can try to help to overcome this issue, but it's I will just say it's definitely a real issue and very important.
That sounds like a great
And
topic.
developers, yes, developers have even mentioned solar. Developers have mentioned this as a limiting factor as well, as we've talked with them about this.
I think that should be our follow-up cafe topic.
That would be great.
Anyone else?
Looks like Bill is
Oh,
raising his
Bill,
hand again.
thank you, Bill.
I have one other question. I'm wondering, when you do the mowing, what happens to the mowed material? Is it left to integrate, or is some fact harvest? I guess one of the things I bring it up, I think you were on the visit to Lanzatech, so one of the things they're exploring is harvesting at the end of the pollinator season and when the birds are gone as well, and then converting that into a biofuel or what have you. So I'm just wondering, in the different systems that are out there now, what's happening to the mowed material?
Jared, did you want to take that? I saw you nodding your head.
Hello. The mowed material can be harvested and used to propagate future habitats.
The seeds, you mean, the seeds that would be in there?
Correct.
But that wouldn't be all the material, so you have a lot of other biomass that something could be done with, right?
We have another question, yeah, from Kate. Many local county ordinances are requiring planting shrubs and trees to screen the facility and specify non-native species. Is there any work being done to drive policy towards native species to support wildlife?
I'll just say that's good to know that they are specifying non-native species. So as far as I know, there is no current work being done to address that, but I will definitely note it down as something that we should be paying attention to. And my hope is that with a guide like this will be a conversation starter that we can interact more with local municipalities or state agencies, extension specialists who might be providing guidance, so that we can start to engage around this topic and start to identify issues exactly what you just brought up, Kate.
Megan asks if you provide bird-friendly mowing practices as well in your guide. Well, Megan, don't feel bad. The guide is hot off the press. We're all anxious to read it. And I did drop a link in the chat, so.
What we did, Megan, was we included a section in the guide to highlight the different considerations around when to mow, since it can vary if you're trying to protect, say you're trying to benefit monarchs versus the rusty patch bumblebee versus birds. The season can vary. And so in the guide, we just point out that, you know, there are people who might prefer mowing in late spring to benefit one species versus late fall to benefit another, but that to maximize the benefit to all species, we recommended a late fall or winter mowing. Paying attention to if you had rusty patch bumblebee on the site, they do nest underground in the winter, and so you wouldn't want to mow too low. You might have to take that into consideration. But in general, to benefit the most species, like trying to avoid some of the reproductive seasons, yes, that trying to avoid those seasons in spring and early fall is the best. And Laura, if you want, I can go to the next slides too, if that's helpful.
Yeah, I mean,
If there are no other
questions, I want to thank everybody for being here today, and I invite you all to develop a cafe with us. We love these discussions and these conversations. So if you have a topic you'd like to hear more about or present about, please reach out to me. On our cafe page, we have recordings of our past webinars and cafes, and you can look at it there. And there's a template that you can download if you have a topic. Just fill it out and submit it back to me, and we can identify a date and time for your cafe. And the next one is I want to thank the Illinois Department of Natural Resources and the U.S. Forest Service for the support for this cafe series. We're really pleased to be able to bring workshops like this to our communities. And to learn more, you can find out more on our website about the Tree City USA program that is run by the Illinois Department of Natural Resources Urban and Community Forestry Program. So thank you very much for being here today. But please, you can stay on and ask questions. That was just my wrap up at the end, and I look forward to sharing this information with all of you in a follow-up email. Yes, thank you to our presenters. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Jared, and thank you, Laura. This was really informative, and I provided good food for thought.